We're one of the first donors to have clear strategies prioritising disability inclusion within our development program. At the recent Global Disability Summit in 2022, we committed to developing a successor policy to underpin our continued commitment to the rights and fundamental freedoms for all people with disabilities, including through the Developmental Cooperation Program. Consultation with people living with disabilities and disabled people's organisations will of course be central to realising this outcome. Australia was also the first financial supporter of and advocate for the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. And just to wrap up, as a founding member of the Global Action on Disability Network and a partner to many people involved in this work, Australia is very pleased to participate in this event this evening and to be working with you all going forward to ensure that the voice and priorities of people living with disabilities is respected and communicated in the effective climate action outcomes we are seeking. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these warming words, and we hope that we can continue to collaborate together. So I give back the floor to Ash for the second part for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia. And I would now like to invite our second speaker for this session, Mr. Tushar Wali, the representative of CBM, to share findings of a research conducted on Madagascar and Bangladesh. Over to you, Mr.
Thank you so much, Asha. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining the session. In next 10 minutes, I will be taking you through the key findings of research we did, which is titled Missing and Climate Action Stories of People with Disabilities from Global South. This research, second slide please. Just to set the context of the research, it was led by Ms. Eleonora Moin, who is identifying herself as a person with disability. It was done with people with disabilities, their organizations, to understand the barriers and opportunities in their engagement in climate action. And many of these organizations are also partners of CBM Global. The research was carried out in 2 countries specifically, Madagascar and Bangladesh. And the methodology followed focus key informant interviews as well as small-scale surveys among people with disabilities with different impairment groups, which included people with psychosocial intellectual disabilities as well as carers. We did engage in translating the surveys into local languages and ensured sign language was available when appropriate and required. And all of this was built on the partnership with organizations of persons with disabilities who played a key role in implementation of this research. Next, please. So very briefly to present the findings, what we found in the research was people with disabilities absolutely want to engage in climate action. What stops them often is the lack of funds, resources, and the capacities to meaningfully engage in the conversation around climate justice and climate adaptation work. People with disabilities have been highly impacted by climate change. This has been very well documented through various research that has been carried out by OHCHR, PDF, and others. However, lack of data and recognition from the government and societies is impeding the next steps towards inclusive climate action, which includes people with disabilities. Next, please. In terms of impact of climate change, I wanted to pick up on 3 issues that came from the research. One was the significant impact on livelihoods. And Shanta did refer to that in his presentation as well. People with disabilities often form some of the most marginalized and poorest people in the communities, and the lack of access to mainstream education and therefore informal employment means that they're quite heavily dependent on agro-based activities. Now that in a climate change context has a huge implication on the financial situation of the people with disabilities and their households. And that has been quite evidently coming out from the research as well. Climate change also has negative health and well-being impact on people with disabilities and their families. And this leads to further feeling of dependency, isolation in the times of displacement that are triggered by climate crisis. All of this also is quite significant in the events where we see extreme weather events pushing more and more people into the trap of poverty. And because many of these early warning systems and actions are not inclusive, it systematically means people with disabilities don't access humanitarian aid equitably. Next. One of the things that came out recurrently and repeatedly in the research was the perception from people with disabilities that their participation recognition was not there at government level, at mainstream climate conversation level, and at decision-making level. And that is something they feel is fundamental to change the discourse of them being seen as climate activists inclusively in the society. Next slide, please. So 4 key messages that came out for us from the research. One was really around data. So the true impact of climate change can only be known if all groups, including people with disabilities, are counted for. As long as we don't have relevant data, this conversation will not move forward. So I was glad to hear from different speakers that there is a commitment, financial commitment, to really look at data desegregation, but also have specific means put behind to build capacity of people with disabilities to take their due role as climate leaders. Climate action has to be people-centered, and it has to be disability-inclusive. Disability-inclusive policies are not just better for people with disabilities, but it takes a whole of society approach and is useful for everybody in the community. And these collaborations among different groups, government, non-governmental stakeholders, is only beneficial as we move the agenda forward. Next slide, please. So 3 key actions that I wanted to present, and it resonates well with the previous speakers as well. Participation and awareness raising around this issue is fundamental if we want to make inclusive climate action a reality. Accessibility, and I couldn't stress more, accessibility is really a precondition for people with disabilities to engage meaningfully in the whole conversation. As long as we don't put sufficient budgetary means and reasonable accommodation measures in place, this will remain a half measure moving forward. And finally, more funds needs to be allocated to build capacities of organizations of persons with disabilities, but also create fundamental linkages between climate actors and organizations of persons with disabilities. I wanted to share maybe a minute video message from one of the activists who had participated in the research. Mark, if you could kindly please play that. We don't hear it. It seems to be some technical problem there. We can come back to that slide later, Mark, if there is a technical glitch. Maybe we can move on to the last slide. We are also publishing the report today, and the report is available on our website. I would urge colleagues and friends here to go and read the report. Hopefully some of the findings will be also useful for us to enhance climate inclusive programming. I thank you all.
Thank you, Tushar. I think evidence from the field based on voices of persons with disabilities will create the change. Both Seta as well as Tushar have made it very clear that where their research is concerned comes from the voice of those people. And that is why I think it's so important to listen to them and for decision makers to take that decision that they need that place on the table. I go now to my next speaker, a very old friend, Shanta. I think it's a day for bridges. Shanta Rao Pariga comes from yeah, okay. While thanking Tushar, I now invite Shanta Rao Bariga, Director of Disability Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. She will move us from Madagascar again to Bangladesh and Australia. And she has been part of the disability work for so long that I don't think that she needs much more invitation. But I pass this to you.
Thank you so much, Ashadi, and it's a pleasure to be here. Great to see that this side event exists and the growing number of side events focusing on people with disabilities. And I must say it's to the credit of the strong participation of organizations of persons with disabilities and their allies, so congratulations. In the spirit of bringing voices of those most impacted by climate change, particularly people with disabilities and older people, I'd like to share some stories from the field based on Human Rights Watch research in Canada, Bangladesh, and Australia. I'd like to start with a quote and a photo that you can see on the screen. It shows a woman named Fatima sitting on a red plastic chair in front of her home, a thatched hut, wearing a sari with red and blue flowers covering her body and hair. She spoke with us about her 12-year-old daughter, Shamsun Nahar, who has a physical disability and died during the June floods in northeastern Bangladesh. Fatima said, "My daughter became sick and had a fever. That fever led to her death. We could not take her to the hospital and could not contact a doctor due to the flood. We could not even bury her properly as it was flooded everywhere. We dug a hole in the soil that filled with water and we just buried her." Unfortunately, Shamsun's tragic death is not the only one. Human Rights Watch has been documenting the disproportionate effect of climate change and extreme weather events on people with disabilities and older people, from deaths to severe impacts on physical and mental health. Take the case of Canada. For example, the government of the British Columbia province confirmed that 91% of those who died in the 2021 heat dome had a chronic medical condition or disability, and 90% of those who died were above the age of 60. In Australia, we found that the authorities failed to take effective steps to protect people with disabilities and older people from foreseeable harm from the catastrophic flooding. Australian local authorities did not provide adequate flood warnings, evacuation, or rescue support, leaving older people, people with disabilities, and those who were pregnant facing life-threatening circumstances with little government assistance. Out of 15 households interviewed, only 2 said that emergency services had knocked on their door and advised them to evacuate. But emergency services offered no assistance, leaving families with small children, older people, and people with disabilities unable to leave. The emergency services also failed to answer the desperate calls for rescues from older people, people with disabilities, people who were pregnant, and parents with young children. We documented the stories of older people who drowned in their homes after they were trapped, and rescue services did not respond to requests to rescue them. We documented residents in their 70s and 80s, some of whom had difficulty walking, who were told to evacuate by authorities but were not offered any assistance to do so. residents in wheelchairs who were only rescued after water had reached over their shoulders, residents with hearing disabilities who nearly drowned in their home after they had not received an evacuation notice and they could not communicate with the rescue services. And we also found in Australia that families with children with autism and who could not swim did not receive any evacuation order from authorities. In Bangladesh, the flooding has killed more than 100 people and severely affected more than 7 million people. Many believe this is one of Bangladesh's worst floods, as we heard from my colleagues here. Thousands of people became homeless and had to move to shelters. People with disabilities, older people, and their families shared with us their experiences of the floods, which will be featured in an upcoming report to be released in the coming weeks. But I'll give you a little preview today. What we found in Bangladesh is that people with disabilities and older people died and faced enormous difficulties to stay alive during the flooding and its aftermath. Fatima was not the only person who told us about family members who died during the floods. We met Mohammed, who's on the screen now, who lost his 20-year-old daughter, Taslima, who lived with physical and psychosocial disabilities. He said, Taslima had stumbled into a hole while coming out of the flooded toilet. She was drowning when we found her and had already swallowed a lot of dirty water. I pulled her out, but she lost consciousness. After finding her, Mohammed approached a village doctor who prescribed some medication for Taslima. However, it didn't help and her health deteriorated. Her family repeatedly tried to find a boat to take her to a hospital, to no avail. Mohammed told us the family didn't have any money to pay for private transportation or treatments. After 10 days, Taslima died. In the picture, you see Mohammed wearing a long, dark red shirt, standing next to a makeshift grave, a square fenced off with branches where they buried Taslima. An important yet often overlooked issue about this intersection between climate change and disability is the serious toll that climate change takes on people's mental health. We heard many times that people feared future flooding, not knowing if they will survive. People with disabilities and older people who did survive this flooding in Bangladesh shared with us their fear of being a burden on their families. We spoke with Mohammed, whom you can see on the screen now, who's wearing a red shirt and a takia hat, sitting on the banks of the local river. He said, "At my house, water was up to my neck. For the first 3 days, we climbed to the rooftop of my tin shed house. Me, my son, my daughter-in-law, my grandchildren, we were all stuck, and there was no food, no aid, no drinking water. We, the older people, are always a burden for a family. During the flood, you cannot imagine how unbearable the situation was." Finally, we observed in Bangladesh that experiences of poverty compounded the impacts of the floods on people with disabilities and older people. Most of those we interviewed lived in poverty and inadequate living conditions even before the floods. But Mohammed and Fatima, who each lost a child after the flood, could not afford medicine or hospital costs. We talked with Mohammed Waris and his family, who lived nearby the local river. When the flood entered their house, their entire belongings were washed away. Their son, Royas, a boy with physical and psychosocial disabilities, drowned because of the flood. Mohammed told us, "I'm a farmer, but now I do not have any job as the lands where I used to work are still underwater. We've been surviving with a loan from neighbors who provided us a loan on high interest. That's the only way we have some money. I do not know what will happen in the coming days, how we will survive." These are just a few examples of how the floods severely impacted people with disabilities and older people. Climate change exacerbates inequalities, and the failures seen in Australia and Bangladesh highlight the urgent need for authorities to ensure inclusive climate action and planning. And we're encouraged by the comments of the Australian climate envoy today in taking that pledge forward. Let me outline a few recommendations for the way ahead. First, governments have a human rights obligation to address climate change by both helping at-risk groups deal with the foreseeable harm of extreme weather events and reducing the global greenhouse gas emissions that are driving them. This is a message to all top emitters. Second, more than ever, this is why we're here. Governments and UN bodies need to ensure that people with disabilities and older people, particularly those with lived experience of extreme weather events, like Shanta mentioned earlier, are included in all climate discussions, including mitigation, adaptation, and preparedness planning. As the International Disability Alliance and McGill University have outlined in their report, too often people with disabilities have been left out of climate action plans. Third, emergency messaging, emergency preparedness, and response programs must be inclusive of and accessible to everyone, underscoring Tushar's point about the importance of accessibility. Fourth, and taking into account the crucial role of humanitarian agencies, people with disabilities and older people must have access to humanitarian support just like anyone else. Timely humanitarian support that prioritizes those most in need is vital, as reflected in the testimonies I shared. Fifth, data collection is required to capture the full scope of extreme weather events. As others mentioned, governments should start collecting disaggregated data of people whose deaths are related to climate change, including by age, gender, and disability. And finally, to all stakeholders, whether government, private, or civil society, there needs to be the meaningful participation of people with disabilities and older people in regional and global discussions about extreme weather events and adaptation plans in the spirit of nothing about us without us. We published a short report on the occasion of COP27 where these and more recommendations, as well as further testimonies, are captured. You can simply look at the QR code and scan that for that report. There has been much rhetoric at COP about listening to the voices of those most impacted, but people with disabilities and older people continue to be invisible. No one should be left behind. As the title of this side event calls for, we need to move from exclusion to leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanta. For people like me who do research on climate change, it's always frustrating that we do not get any data. And this has been for the last 10 years that I worked on it. So reports that Shanta has brought forward through Human Rights Watch is something that will fill the gap that is there. And I'm sure that all these 3 reports that are there will keep us going for the next couple of years till states agree and states will decide that persons with disabilities should be included in the databases that they have. Now, it's my great pleasure to invite Elham Yousafin, Inclusive Humanitarian Action and Disaster Risk Reduction Advisor of the International Disability Alliance, to share the most recent updates on IDA's joint research with McGill University, analyzing national climate policies and commitments from disability inclusion perspective. Elham is our last speaker of the day, and I'm sure that what Elham is going to bring to us will fill that circle that we are talking about today.
Thank you very much, Asha. Thank you very much, everyone, for choosing to follow this side event. I hope that we can share the recording later. So for those who couldn't be with us because of the change of the room and also difficulties in live stream and all of that, can follow the wonderful contributions that panelists and speakers made before me. So we just heard a lot of very tragic stories and evidence about how climate change impacts persons with disabilities disproportionately, and how all of us are failing to address that, and also how climate policies and commitments are yet to include persons with disabilities. So, of course, the most important means to address that would be to include persons with disabilities in national climate policies and programs. With assistance and great research from McGill University, we looked at all the climate commitments and policies that governments have made. A first version of this report was published in June 2022, where we analyzed the national determined contributions as well as national adaptation and mitigation policies. The second version of this report is going to be published very soon, but today I have the pleasure to share with you the findings of that research already, and when its research is published, we will be, of course, promoting and advertising for those interested. In this new set of research, we actually decided to change the methodology. So in the first and second slides that we have, and I'm going to explain right now, we decided to adopt a slightly different methodology, because it would be very just simplistic to just say, yeah, there is a reference to disability, or there is not a reference to disability in certain policies. So we wanted to be a little bit more specific, and we actually learned that from a wonderful research paper that has been done by one colleague in the indigenous people sector, that will be properly referenced, of course, in the report, to look into the policies and ask a few questions. One, is the policy using the rights-based language or is adopting the medical language? So for those who are more familiar, they know that when we talk about persons with disabilities, we use the language person first. We do not use the medical words such as special needs or people in need or other medical languages. So the first question was that language used or not? The second question was that did the policy include any concrete action on inclusion of persons with disabilities? The third question was that, was the policy looking to the issue from the disability rights and mentioning human rights of persons with disabilities? The fourth question was that, did the policy recognize the specific knowledge and expertise of persons with disabilities as climate actors? 5, is the policy recognizing participation of persons with disabilities and their organizations in climate action? And finally, was the process of adopting the policy included participation of persons with disabilities? Did persons with disabilities and their organizations were part of the adaptation and design of the policy? So we can look at slide number 3 now. That tells us that only 37 parties to the Paris Agreement, which means 19% of countries who have ratified Paris Agreement, who are actually almost all countries all over the world, have some reference to persons with disabilities in general, altogether, in their national determined contributions, or what we call NDCs. 5 parties mention persons with disabilities in mitigation, 14 mention in adaptation, and 19 mention both in mitigation and adaptation. Again, we are talking about NDCs, which is a commitment that governments express under Paris Agreement. So this is something also at international level. In slide number 5, you see what I just told you about the different methodology, the different questions that we had. So 14 of them included concrete measures for disability inclusion. Only 4 of them referenced to disability rights, which underlies the importance of highlighting rights-based approach and human rights of persons with disabilities in climate action. Only 4 of them recognize knowledge of persons with disabilities, which again rings the bell. 17 of them recognize the participation of persons with disabilities. And only in 2 of them we have evidence of participation and involvement of persons with disabilities in the process. So we had that, so that very clearly showcased where we are standing. So when we also looked at the climate national adaptation plans, NAPS, which is a national plan at national level that governments adopt to address climate adaptation. Only 46% of governments parties to Paris Agreement, 46 countries, which means 24%, have some reference to disability in their national adaptation plans. So 15 of them have concrete measures. Again, 2 of them only reference to disability rights. 2 of them recognize knowledge of persons with disabilities. 11 of them recognize participation, and only in 1 of them we have evidence of participation. We found out that most adaptation policies include very vague references to disability, which is something that we need to address. We also looked at climate mitigation policies, national climate mitigation policies, and we found out that none of them has any mention on persons with disabilities. So that alone gives us a lot of work ahead of us, and that's what requires, in my opinion, first and foremost, collaboration between organizations of persons with disabilities on one side and climate actors, the civil society working on climate change on the other side. We, as the organizations of persons with disabilities, have the knowledge and expertise, but we are not super familiar with all the climate processes at national and international level. And by ourselves, our voice will not be amplified. But the strategy forward is to amplify each other's voice and collaborate. So if there is one key recommendation that I want to give and I want people to take away, is that if you're an OPD, reach out for climate actors. If you're a climate actor, if you're an environmentalist, if you're a civil society, reach out for OPDs. And together, with your collaboration, we can address this situation. So hopefully in next COP, I have better information to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, for setting the agenda for us for the next maybe couple of years, not only till the next COP, because this is what we really need. We need not only research which has numbers, we also need research that is value-based, based on the rights of persons with disabilities. So we finished this section coming to know so much about what has been done across the globe in many of the countries, and also what is that we need to study, what is it that we need to do in the few years that we have before us till we reach everyone else on the same platform at the same level. While I thank all the participants who spoke today, and I request now Markeli to chair the question and answer session.
Thank you, Asha. I'm going to break the mold a little bit and talk. I just want to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Markeli Alexander. I'm the president of Sustain Our Abilities, which is an NGO that specifically works to bridge persons with disabilities and people in the rehabilitation and health field to work together on climate change and disability. And I'm also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Climate Change and Health. I want to say here that Asha has a beautiful exhibit, number 49, that is going on through Shanta Memorial, and Sustain Our Abilities has number 45, and we have many videos of persons with disabilities also describing their experiences from Puerto Rico, from Greece, from South America, so I'd invite you all to join us for this. Thank everyone for speaking, and I'm wondering if there are any questions from the audience now for any of the panelists. Yes.
Thank you so much, Makali. Just that recognizing the challenges which the panelists have raised and the really extreme stories which we have heard this evening, if you had one message for the policymakers at COP this week and next week, what would your message be? What would you urge them to decide that would try to rectify some of the terrible, terrible situations that you shared with us?
Do you want to start, Nadia?
Okay, if you can hold it. So yeah, all climate policy must be inclusive and accessible, advancing the human rights of persons with disabilities. And these policies include, but are not limited to transport, food security, and access to adequate nutrition for all, energy or energy pricing, infrastructure, communication, economic transition, employment and training, education, disaster preparedness, and management and human rights action.
I think she's about covered everything. Does anyone else want to answer?
Well, I did share my message for actors, but if I have access to negotiators in COP27, I ask them, include persons with disabilities in action for climate empowerment, because that's what we need. Education, training, access to information, and participation is the key so that we have the information, the channels, so that we can tell the world how to address disability inclusion, not just disability inclusion, but to address climate change in general. So that would be my message for negotiators. Seta? You want to share anything?
Yeah. Hello, mine would be, give us our fair share of the cake. That it's not just funding, it's policy, and to me it's equity. I said it earlier today, it's not just inclusion, it's not just inclusive policy, it must be inclusive and equitable policy. Because climate change impact, they do not discriminate. Sometimes we are forgotten, we are the forgotten group. So they need to give us the fair share of our cake, whatever that will be. Thank you.
Do you want to say anything?
Just one thing, that when there are elections, most people would go to the field, politicians, to ask people for their vote. In this way, I think when climate policies are being made, the politicians should go to the field to ask persons with disabilities what they would like to be included in the policies. I think that would create a change.
For me, I think if I had one message to the audience, not just here, but anybody who is listening online, it's we need to break the silos and the ways we are working. I think if you really want to have people with disabilities included in mainstream development and acknowledge the risks that are posed by disasters and climate, we need to start working together and not address the issues with separate ministries, with separate funding streams. We need to somehow start to look at it from a community's perspective and start to address it right from there. As long as we keep the silos there, it's going to be very hard to achieve sustainable development goals, all of which are being every day eroded because we are not acting now and enough.
Thank you, Tushar. You stole my answer. I was also going to talk about the silos, but maybe I will build on that and just mention and underscore Elham's point, because I do feel, I think one of the gaps that we need to fill is engaging with mainstream climate organizations so that they understand how people with disabilities and older people are affected and include that in their programming, because really operating outside of that bubble, we're voices that are speaking out in the void. And I think if you look in this audience, you know, it's grateful that we have some supportive governments here, but I'm not sure there is the active listening of mainstream climate organizations, and we need to make sure that that dialogue is deepened, and that we are listening to them to learn, but that they are also listening to people with disabilities and their representative organizations and allies who are fighting on this issue as well.
I would just echo the comment on silos, though, and I would challenge everyone here, because I think one thing is that persons with the lived experience of disabilities, indigenous peoples, persons in the health community, persons in the elderly community, women, people from small island states, I think our all-inclusive challenge is to make sure we all get together and we're all in the same room, because if we don't all work together in solidarity, then we're all going to lose. So that was one thing I would also add in terms of silos. I think it's really important here that we all work together. And so that is my comment. I also have one question for everyone. And I don't know if anyone has an answer to this, but I am and I know this is a really hard time of the day. It's the end of the day, but I'm struck by the small number of people in the room. And my question is, if there are 1 out of 6 people in the world living with a disability, and there are 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 people here, how do we interest people with disabilities in climate change? Because that's always been something I've wanted to do, and it's been very, very difficult. So there's a small group here, but how do we interest all the other people in the world to come out? Because it's so challenging to live with a disability. How do we get those billion people to become activists like the people up here? Does anybody have any thoughts in terms of that? Nadia, maybe.
Yeah, just by building capacity for those people, make them aware that it's important that they raise their voices, that they are involved. And so the governments also need to support this kind of meaningful involvement from the beginning. No measures of climate change can be taken without implementing other persons with disabilities.
All right. Any other questions?
Yes, thanks very much. My name is Anna Merrifield. I'm from the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Apologies for coming so late. I mean, it is a bit ironic. I looked for the proper conference room for about 40 minutes, and that's kind of ironic because one of the issues that you highlighted is the lack of access, and I felt that this was like underline the kind of how difficult it was for me, you know, to get into this conference room. On the issue of access, I'd like to understand a bit better when you talk about the kind of the need to ensure access in, well, maybe mainly in the climate action plans. What can you give some concrete examples? What's meant by that? Because I think we were talking a lot about, for example, climate disasters. You know. Floods, I understand it in the context of early warning systems, for example, but can you give some other examples?
Does anyone want to take this on?
Thank you very much for joining us, and sincere apologies. It has been very, very difficult from logistic-wise to organize this meeting, so we really appreciate you coming here. Just to give concrete examples, so what a national plan would include? A national plan would include, for example, the government is going to dedicate this amount of budget to address the impact of climate change on agriculture. And then we're going to define like, programs that would be like addressing the barriers that the farmers gonna face. Does that include persons with disabilities? Do they consider that there are some farmers who are persons with disabilities? Or for example, they say in terms of adaptation that we're gonna build resilient cities, right? Climate resilient cities. That's one example that we had, that for example, they're building climate resilient cities, but they forget accessibility. Why? Because in the National Action Plan on building resilient cities, they forget to mention in building the resilient cities, ensure that every building is made accessible for persons with disabilities. So these are just very, very concrete examples, but if you give me your National Action Plan, I can give you one by one, step by step on each part to how we can include persons with disabilities. So these are just I hope it is helpful.
I would also say if you Google climate change, disability, and rehabilitation, we did a 6-hour seminar a couple weeks ago with including the views of persons with disabilities and various issues of climate and health and disability rights, etc. Yes. All right. If we're done with the questions, I would like to introduce Mr. Gerard Quinn, who, if we can get him on the video, is the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Disability. Disability rights. I see a blue line around the circle with GQ. We don't hear you. You may be muted. No, we can't hear you. They're working on it. What?
Oh dear.
Now we hear you.
Okay. Technology is leaving us down. I'm sorry about that. So thank you so much, Madam Chair. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be with you today. It's been a fascinating and enlightening seminar and a first, really, I think. I apologize I can't be there in person. I have a previous existing appointment in Abu Dhabi, which I can't leave behind. I want to thank the delegations of Finland, Australia, the UK, European Disability Forum and others for sponsoring this important event. It fits perfectly with my work as UN Special Rapporteur. One thing I told the Human Rights Council when I took on this post is I wanted to elevate the disability debate beyond soft social policy and connect it directly and visibly to grand challenges facing humanity, which includes armed conflict, artificial intelligence, but also climate change. So it's a real pleasure and an honor to be with you. I was asked to try and thread together some of the common themes running throughout the presentations. I will do that, but I do not pretend to be scientific. I wish to only isolate 4 or 5 large points and 1 or 2 key messages, at least that I heard. Right at the outset, we heard from the get-go from Ian Fry, the UN Special Rapporteur, and from our colleagues from the UK and from Australia, a frank acknowledgement that people with disabilities were at the forefront of the impact of climate change and were often the furthest left behind. This is exactly the words of Ian Fry, and our UK colleague reiterated that by reminding us that people with disabilities are disproportionately affected by climate change. So at the grand level, that was extremely welcome, but the research reported to us gave us granular detail on that from the Pacific Forum, from CBM, from Human Rights Watch, and indeed from McGill University. All of that granular detail is now overwhelming that the impact is direct as well as indirect on key rights like the right to life, the right to health, employment and livelihood, accessible evacuation, and indeed accessible humanitarian intervention. So there ought to be no longer a debate about the place of disability in the overall firmament. There ought to be a more practical debate about how we can move the dial forward. And that's where we get to the third point, which is really the ethic of participation. I think it's incredibly important to point out that this is morally important, but it's also important for the evolution of rational evidence-based policy on the part of government. You simply cannot do that without having people directly affected at the table and informing you what the impact is, how they can be avoided, and how we can rebuild more inclusive and resilient societies. And arguably, participation is required by the UN Disability Treaty. CBM, I think, emphasized in its research that the vast majority of people with disabilities want to engage. They're keen to engage. And this, therefore, is an untapped resource that states can be using to inform, broaden, and deepen rational policy formulation into the country. We also heard from some delegations about how this process is proceeding. And it's very piecemeal at the moment, but there are some good stories here that we should be replicating and building on. For example, our colleague from the UK pointed out 3 commitments of the UK government in the last Global Disability Summit, which is very welcome. The innovation within GLAD, the International Donors Network, is also to be very welcome. The network of governments being put together by Finland on disability and climate change is also to be very welcomed. I think we're really only at the beginning of the journey, and these governments are to be congratulated for at least initiating that process. But we need to push the window open wider, and we need to make the point that the engagement of people with disabilities isn't just the right thing to do, it's the rational thing to do if governments want to plan accordingly. We heard little hints, but I think they can be built on, about the intersectional impacts of climate change on people with disabilities, also on older people and other groups who find themselves in vulnerable situations. I think natural alliances can probably be built with these other groups to try and magnify our voice in the process as it moves forward. Last but not least, several individuals and several participants pointed out the non sequitur, the gap between debates on climate change and debates on disability. Elham very eloquently said we need to be reaching out to each other. We need to close that gap, and we need to make sure that governments see the input of people with disabilities not as a side constraint on how they respond to climate change, but actually as a necessary precondition to ensure rational policy formulation in the way ahead. So thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize if I missed some other inputs, but that is my way of summing up the debate, which I found extremely useful. Thank you so much, and I'm sorry you can't see me.
Thank you so much, Mr. Quinn. And now we have just seen you. You were blanked out before, and now we see you. So have a wonderful evening. I have the privilege of thanking everyone for being here today. I'm not going to repeat everyone's names and positions again because I honestly don't have the mental capacity at this hour of the day to do it. But this has been a fabulous event highlighting really the needs and the importance of including persons with a lived experience of disabilities in the process of really fighting climate change for all of us around the world. And everyone, please have a great rest, and thank you all.